If you thought things couldn't get any darker after vampires and bayou beasts, think again. This week, we've been cordially invited to Madame LaLaurie's dinner party. So, Folktownies, change out of your sweats, put on your finest formal wear, and whatever you do, don't go into the attic.
Sarah and Eliza stood hand in hand and stared up at the mansion that was about to become their home. They were sisters, and they'd just been sold to Madame Delphine LaLaurie, one of New Orleans' most wealthy and well-known socialites. They were about to find out what kind of a slave owner she would be. The year was 1833, and New Orleans was a city of opulence. At the heart of the social scene was the LaLaurie Mansion, one of the city's grandest homes. Cheerful flower baskets hung from the large balcony, and 2 well-dressed footmen greeted the women at the gate. Most of the slaves appointed to the LaLaurie Mansion counted themselves lucky. They enjoyed comfortable lodging, fine food, and were spared the harshest labors. Madame LaLaurie, dressed in a crimson gown as if ready to host one of her lavish parties, greeted the sisters as they entered. "Welcome, girls. I trust you'll find yourselves comfortable here," she said before beginning a tour of the mansion. Sarah, the eldest, was chosen as the new cook and was shown to the kitchen. Eliza, who would help with the laundry, was brought to the washroom downstairs. The sisters' living quarters were far from each other, so their paths would seldom cross, but they were grateful nonetheless to be together in this new, beautiful place. Only one thing set them on edge. At the end of their tour, Madame LaLaurie told them the most important rule of the house. Never, under any circumstances, are you to enter the attic, she said. My husband's work demands great privacy. Monsieur LaLaurie, they learned, was a doctor and didn't like to be disturbed when seeing his patients. The women nodded in agreement. Sarah and Eliza got on agreeably for the first few weeks, but as the weeks turned to months, something strange began to happen. One by one, Sarah noticed certain slaves were missing at mealtimes. After a while, she'd stopped seeing them altogether. Perhaps they were sold, she thought. It's not my place to inquire. And then one night, it was her sister, Eliza, who didn't show up for dinner, and Sarah's curiosity turned to a gnawing dread. 2 more days passed with no sign of Eliza, and Sarah could stand it no longer. She resolved to search the mansion for answers, and she knew where she had to start. She was frightened of disobeying her master, but the thought of losing her sister was too much to bear. Early one morning, while the rest of the house slept, Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to the attic and turned the handle on the one door she was forbidden to open. Inside was a scene beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. This was no medical office. It was a chamber of torture. Chained to the wall were 6 of the missing slaves. Some had their eyes gouged out, others were missing fingernails. Mouths and ears were stuffed full of fireplace ash and animal insides. The worst victims were missing limbs or had body parts sewn to places they didn't belong. It was clear the victims had been there for months, and there among them was Eliza, her lips sewn shut, unable to scream for help. But before Sarah could run to her sister, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. "What do you think you're doing?" Madame LaLaurie hissed. The madame gripped Sarah by her hair and yanked her backward out of the attic and down the stairs to the kitchen. "This will teach you to go where you're not wanted," she barked, wrapping a heavy iron cuff around Sarah's left wrist and shackling it to the floor. She wouldn't be leaving the kitchen anymore. Weeks passed in agony, Sarah's heart aching for her sister and the others trapped upstairs. The parties continued, the city's most powerful lawmakers and businessmen mingling in the parlor ignorant to the horrors just above their heads. Sarah knew she had to do something. She would get the word out about this house of torture, even if it meant risking her own life. After all, it was only a matter of time before she, too, ended up in the attic. The next morning, Sarah dropped a lit match behind the kitchen stove and ignited a grease fire that sent thick, black smoke filling the mansion. As the flames spread, the neighborhood descended into chaos. It wasn't long after the authorities arrived to empty the house of its residents that they discovered the grisly scene in the attic and the true nature of Madame LaLaurie. But unfortunately for the police, it was already too late to bring Madame LaLaurie to justice. Realizing her time was up, the Madame rushed to her carriage amid the commotion of the fire and fled the city, never to be seen again. The LaLaurie mansion, however, would live on, an uncanny reminder of the worst that humanity can do. As the home has changed hands over the years, one thing has never ceased. Visitors continue to report hearing moans, knocks, whispers, clinking chains, and shuffling feet throughout the home. Many believe the spirit of Madame LaLaurie still haunts it, its walls echoing forever with memories of the horrors at her hand.
Okay, so that story was a doozy. That was insane.
Yeah, that was spooky.
I mean, I'm ready for it.
Sorry, spooky's not the right word. It was
Intense?
like eerie.
It was gross.
Disturbing.
Yeah, disturbing's probably better.
Mm-hmm.
I had maybe heard of this story, but didn't know a lot of it until American Horror Story: The Coven, which is my probably favorite season of that show.
Mm-hmm.
And we've all seen it, yes?
Yeah,
absolutely.
you guys convinced me to watch it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Madame LaLaurie is played by Kathy Bates.
One and only.
Not true to how she looked at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They definitely had a lot of liberties
yeah.
with
Sure.
the story. I mean, I think the way that they took the story, Kathy Bates killed it.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Pun intended.
They went
Yeah.
a different way.
There's
for sure.
no one else that now, the way that they did the story, I can't picture anyone but Kathy Bates playing it.
Agreed 100%.
It's almost hard to picture the real story now without picturing Kathy Bates. But
I was literally picturing
Kathy Bates the whole time.
Yeah,
And here's the thing, though, that I listened to the last podcast on the left episode about Madame LaLaurie and the gruesome things. And, you know, Deena had talked about this off camera, but this is different than our other episodes because
it's real.
yeah, these are real people.
Yeah. And I love how we didn't even do this on purpose, but first episode, vampires, second episode, Ruru, monsters, right? These creatures, legends like that may or may not be
There's
real.
no physical.
Right? And now such a switch in dynamic. We have this real woman, real house, place that you could physically go and visit, someone who is documented in the history books. Like, there's no disputing this. I mean, the details are definitely skewed. You know, I think from what we've all researched, we're all going to kind of present some different arguments on what we've found. But
Yeah.
this is a real woman now.
And back to that last podcast on the left episode, there is a description, and I think it's a police report that says after the fire and the house burnt down, the bodies that they found, there were women whose intestines were outside their body wrapped around their midsection to make them look tinier. There were body parts sewn onto the face.
I have so many questions about this.
People. There were,
So many questions.
you know, they found animal feces inside certain holes of people's
Yeah.
bodies.
Well, I also I think when I think of a house like being inflamed with fire, the house didn't actually burn down. There was more smoke damage. And so that's how they were able to then go in and discover all this stuff. Because when I think of a house burning down, I think of like there's nothing left, right?
Thank you so much for clarifying that, because I was definitely thinking that.
Yeah, but that's the thing is like the house was still standing. And that's why when they went into the attic, and obviously they were probably checking for, you know, survivors or things like that. And then that's when they discovered, which is, can you imagine? Because I would assume it's firefighters going in there.
Yep.
Even though it was, you know, what year? It was a long time ago. But like, they're the ones that discovered this.
And not only that, so, I mean, we always bring it to Outlander. But, in the American Horror Story show, there's scenes of Kathy Bates bathing in the blood of these young, beautiful slaves, thinking it will make her look younger and make her like ever long life and she'll live forever, similar to Gayless Duncan in Outlander. And I saw a lot of crossover articles about how like perhaps that was based on the Madame LaLaurie story.
Inspiration there.
Because she was doing the exact same thing, but she was doing it with virgin men. But she was also known to, like Gayless Duncan kind of touches on it in Outlander about how she had these slaves that she did horrific things to. I don't know how we can always do it, no matter where we are.
I didn't know that. I didn't pick up on that.
We bring it back to Outlander.
I mean,
thanks, Diana.
You're the best. You're the best. But when we decided to do New Orleans, when we were talking about this, it was, you can't talk about New Orleans and not talk about this.
It's impossible.
And it's so sensationalized.
And I was going to say, like, both you and Deena said to me, like, oh, do you know about Madame LaLaurie? And I was like, I've never heard of this woman. And so then, of course, that's when I decided to watch.
Okay, this is interesting then. What did you think after watching it, knowing, because we had told you at the time, this is a real person?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was insane. Obviously, it's American Horror Story was my reference, right?
Yeah.
But then, of course, I went down a rabbit hole of like looking into actual. And, despite the creative freedoms that the show took, it's not that far from what potentially could have been what happened. And it's so disturbing. And also, though, I wonder a little bit, and this is just a theory I have, but I wonder a little bit. So according to some reports and stuff, her husband was a doctor or some form of medical professional.
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, I think of Outlander, and women back in that time weren't allowed to practice medicine. They could be nurses, they could be healers, but they couldn't practice medicine. So in my mind, I'm like, was she someone that was trying experiments to learn the medical field? Because her husband was very wealthy. They bought a very beautiful mansion, and she was able to explore that maybe want or desire to find out more about medical stuff, which
this is a perfect segue.
And so I'm curious.
I'm sitting over here ready to go.
Like, does that speak to who she was as a person? Like, obviously we know it as like this horrific thing, but is there more truth to this, as in like she wasn't allowed to do these things, so she was experimenting to learn or teach herself? I think of Claire, practicing and learning how to grow penicillin and like doing this stuff that could look really terrifying to someone that doesn't know what's happening.
Well, she was a witch.
And like the same thing with like experimenting on, someone that's obviously it's a dead body and they're doing experiments to the dead body, but obviously maybe these weren't dead bodies. And that's where, stuff was discovered. But
so do you say yes or do you say no, Amanda?
Do I say yes or no what?
That
she was.
That she could have been.
Well, here's the thing. I want to hold off judgment because you are going to school me in a second.
Yeah.
I know that. I know that about you. I've
like
been friends with you for
I almost want to like rip off
years.
my Folktown hoodie right now and reveal my t-shirt. It's
the rational side of my brain is like, no, this is probably what she was doing.
I mean, I see your point. I initially would have said the same thing.
I think I'm hard pressed to say that, and I know that you kind of presented this idea before we started recording, so I'm a little bit influenced by this. Mm-hmm. I do think these atrocities really happened. I do not want to discount the fact that these horrific things were happening in this house.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
I also think that you are about to present us with information that may change my mind about the fact that it was just her or her alone, or was she influenced by her husband? I don't want to discount the fact that these things happened. It is documented that they happened.
Yeah.
But where is the proof that it was her? And I know that that's you telling me that earlier, that maybe this wasn't. So I'm going to just give the floor to you. You tell me. And I'm going to erase that as Kathy Bates.
Yeah. but that's where I began as well. That I was just like, she must have had some sick fascination with this, right? That an experiment is an experiment, right? She was trying all of these things, and for what purpose, right?
Right.
You know? And one line that I did read was the fact that her husband had been left out of all of these legends. How many different versions of this story did we read that there was literally no mention of him? And I was like, ew. Ew. You know, like horrified, honestly, by myself, that I never once considered that like we're all blaming her over and over and over and over again in all of these stories. And did no one ever once question like where he was this whole time? And first off, I was like, oh my God, I am so sorry. You know, like shame on me. But same thing. I'm not saying they didn't happen. I question, did every single one of them that we hear in some of these stories, you know, happen the way that they happen? You know, like, you know how some things, like you said, can get sensationalized. Like, we know that the American Horror Story version of this did not necessarily happen. Like, I don't know if there really was some guy who had a bull's head, you know, like attached to the top of his body, you know, and, you know, it was like walking around and stuff like that. And we know that the relationship between LaLaurie and Marie Laveau was definitely fictionalized the way that it was presented in that show. So there's a lot that, you know, you got to take yourself out of that show and like really like, okay, we got to just remember like Angela Bassett was phenomenal. But
can't wait.
But so first off, do you know she was married 3 times? Like, this chick was a baddie, okay? And again, I am in no way, shape, or form criticizing the goddess that is my Kathy Bates, because Misery is one of my all-time favorite movies. You were asking me about like favorite Halloween movies. Stephen King, that movie, that book, oh my God, it's one of my favorites because of her.
Yes.
All right. So sorry, but okay. You know,
she's supposed to be super hot, right?
She
It's
was
not who you envision.
literally on record for her beauty, charm, like everything. Okay. And she held out. Like, you know, women back then got married early, right? 16, 17. She didn't get married until she was in her like early 20s. And she was married 3 times, had a bajillion children too, by the way. Like, God bless her. And always documented for her beauty, charm. She had there was no instance of her having some sort of like dark childhood, evil parents, like any sort of like psychological damage that you would think that would have led her to being some like twisted person down the road.
She didn't have the trifecta. Don't they say that there's like the trifecta, like a head injury, wets the bed, likes fire, cruelty to animals, you know, like. Yeah,
like to get to that like homicidal maniac.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing that said like we could have went from 0 to 100 like this. So she winds up marrying Louis Nichols LaLaurie. All right. He's from France. He was somewhat younger than her.
Okay, girl.
All right. But he was described as a mediocre medical student, but he had an eye for scientific detail. Okay. And he did not want to restrict himself to just one area of medicine, which at the time, again, taking yourself out of the American Horror Story mindset and putting yourself into the 1800s, it was not unheard of to restrict yourself to one area. Medicine wasn't regulated back then. So it wasn't unusual for doctors to just randomly switch specialties. And he's been left out, and there's no proof that the medical experiments that actually took place were done by her. So this attic that is in the house, which he didn't have his own practice at the time, and technically he worked out of the house when he was hired to do X, Y, and Z, he could have had his own little space in the attic. He could have been doing whatever was around. And it was said that, this is my favorite, that he liked testing Haitian-style zombie drugs to try and induce cooperation and docility in troublesome slaves.
So we're talking Bill Cosby situation here. He's playing with the sedatives and...
Now, they said that failures were poisoned and thrown into the swamp.
So he's not great.
He is not great.
Okay.
And I'm sure he's chalking this all up to science.
And you're married to that.
With children in the house.
But loaded.
Beyond loaded. Yes.
And so you're saying, I think.
And a lot of the wealth is also hers too.
Okay.
Let's also very clarify that she is from a wealthy family and she had money from her 2 previous marriages as well. And just fun fact, her second husband, who either died or just disappeared.
Well, that's not a good look for her.
No, but because he was a pirate. He was in pirate.
Of course he was.
Yeah, he was totally grimy dude. Not a good marriage there. And during that marriage, I feel I need to bring up, she is on record. This was in 1819 with a parish court having wanted to emancipate one of her slaves. His name was Jean-Louis. He was upwards of 50 years of age, and she is documented on saying that she wanted to have him emancipated. And she also did this with 1 or 2 other former slaves. And it just seems very odd that she would be doing this. And then, down the road, she's supposedly torturing and decapitating and chopping them up.
Now that's okay. That makes me also feel really bad for her if this is true, that this poor lady has fallen into the, zeitgeist of her husband's mess ups.
Mm-hmm.
But to this time period, it is harder, I think, to sell that the husband did it and she didn't have any idea. Do you know what I'm saying?
Agreed.
Like,
fair.
They're
fair,
already
definitely.
selling the story that she did it and the husband's nowhere to be mentioned, right?
Mhm.
Like, we did mention it in ours because we did our due diligence and, who the hell was she married to? She had to know this was going on.
Sure.
I'm just going to throw this out here. I feel like
Okay.
this is like a standard lore kind of thing, is if you want the story to be told, you tell it yourself. So was
Sure.
she taking the stories and making them focused on her so that she has she becomes this person?
Well,
Okay.
to add to the drama,
We love the drama.
Okay.
Mhm.
October 26th. Love this because it's right before Halloween. 1832. She petitions the court again to free another slave. All right. Another Creole at about the age of 40, 45. All right. Which I'm also noticing, these slaves, they're aging out, right? Which I
Yeah.
almost can appreciate. God bless her. They're getting older. Probably can't do the same work. Love that. And it's only 8 months before this fire is about to happen. Okay. So, and it's also right before she files for separation because apparently Doc is abusive.
Oh, boy.
All right. So
Okay. I'm painting a different story in my head. Keep going.
Mhm.
Right. So it said, went so far as to not only ill-treat her, but was to beat and wound her in the most outrageous and illegible manner. She said this incident happened on October 26th, the same day as when they petitioned the court about this slave. So the fire happened on April 10th, 1834. Okay. And it's on record, as I'm sure you're going to talk about. It's in the newspaper. It's in this, I love the name of this newspaper, by the way, the New Orleans Bee.
I do like that.
Adorable. You can find the
Yeah.
article. You can read the article.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it, but I'm not saying it's not horrific. It's not good.
Mhm.
Okay. But it's not as bad as what a lot of these legends have built it up to be.
Mhm.
So, she did escape. She did get out of there and she went to Paris with her 3 young children because she had to
Mhm.
get on out of there and change her name. But the husband disappears into the night, never to be heard from again.
Okay.
She's
So-
left with the baggage.
I wonder if she started the fire and she was like, this is never going to end. And the only way we're getting the hell out of here is if I start the fire, unleash and tell everybody what he's been up to, because nobody would believe me if I said this. And we're also forgetting that they used to throw these very lavish parties
Yes.
at this
yes,
house.
yes, yes.
Mhm.
And you wanted to be invited to these parties.
Mhm.
Anyone who was anyone was at these parties. And I guarantee, that there's if we're painting the picture in that light, maybe she set the fire herself to be like, somebody has to stop this because it's gotten absolutely insane. And maybe the hopes to free the slave was like, he's going to tell people. If he's out of this house, I'm giving him permission to tell people.
And is it just her going to petition the courts? Or is her husband with her?
I would assume it's just her for separation.
And he, yeah.
So he found out.
Yes.
Beat her. She lights the fire. She gets away.
I almost feel like it led me to believe that that fight happened because she was trying to free a slave.
Yeah.
That's not for the part of separation.
Oh no, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Like that happened and then she was like, yo, I'm out.
Yeah.
So her house has to be one of the most haunted houses. I mean, like every time you look up most haunted houses in New Orleans, her house has got to be. If these atrocities are happening in the house, and did they find all these bodies underneath the house? I mean, I don't want to spoil it because I know that you're going to talk about the house, Dayelle, but like it has to be insanely haunted.
We need a second person to speak up. Like we need to hear from somebody else.
Yeah.
This poor. I don't want to say that because like what if this is not true? This is all alleged, right? And if this story, which where I got this information from seems pretty solid. It was a wonderfully written book on her and very well documented. They spent such a long time researching this. Really spent time in New Orleans, firsthand sources, things like that. But if you don't have other people who can corroborate your story, and she had so many children,
Yeah.
And her first child from her first marriage, Borquita, who's mentioned actually in American Horror Story, lived in New Orleans the entire time. She is a staple of New Orleans. And I'm just like, no one thought to question her? Like, come on. Like, I need a child to speak up. Speak up for your mother. Tell me, is she really this kind of person? Is it all fake? Is it just an act? Like she twisted? Like someone say something,
Well, I mean, I don't think we'll ever know.
No, we probably won't.
I do know that the house still is standing, exists.
Yeah.
It is a house, and I'm not going to bury the lead on who purchased it, but Dayelle, you're going to tell us a little bit about this creep show house.
Yeah, so it's interesting because it all kind of ties together with everything that Deena was talking about. So the house sits on the corner of Royal and Governor Nicholas Streets. It's a 3-story antebellum estate, and it's kind of it's beautiful when you look at photos of it and stuff. It's a very pretty house. It sits strictly on the corner. Its actual address is 1140 Royal Street.
Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah.
GPS it right now.
It was built in 1831. Madame LaLaurie's husband and the couple, they built
Leonard.
Yep, they built this house. And it's funny because when you kind of like research this house a little bit, the smallest part of this story is the story of the fire that kind of like sparks it. So it's 4 years kind of. So the house was built in 1831. The fire broke out in 1834. Obviously, we kind of know what happened then. Like people went into the house. They discovered the horrible things in the attic. Delphine was gone. She ran. She took everything, whatever. So obviously this house is sitting there. And I would assume it was, purchased by a bank or they took it over because no one was claiming it. But given its history, it's going to be really hard to sell this house. So over the years, it changed hands numerous times. It went through renovations, rebuilds. It just couldn't shake this reputation that it had. One of the earliest owners following LaLaurie's departure was a wealthy man named Paris Trustor. He purchased the building at the beginning of soon after the house had been kind of restored after the fire. He was the first person to purchase it. But what happened, no one really knows what happened to this guy. He just was wasn't a fan of living in this house. So very soon after purchasing it, he sells it.
Poof.
It then becomes, it gets converted into apartments, and it's kind of a place for lower income housing. And the tenants that lived there were numerous accounts of like strange noises, ghostly apparitions, eerie things happening. There also was an account of someone being murdered in the home. When you like dive into that, you can't really find any actual evidence of that. But they said that the reports, some people say that the reports that they looked through say that they couldn't figure out what happened to this person. It was under very strange circumstances that the person was murdered. Obviously, then again, the house is up for sale. In the 1880s, the building was sold to a man named Jules Vigini. I'm not saying that
That's
right.
unfortunate.
Oh my God, what an amazing
that's
last
unfortunate.
name.
It's spelled Vignie. So.
Nope. I like Vigine better. Talk to me about the Vigine.
He's a super wealthy
Incredible.
man. Of course, right? He's a
Can you
wealthy
imagine
man.
if that was the last name of one of my students? Sorry, just pause for a moment.
That's a tough name. He's super wealthy man, but he was a recluse and he lived in only part of the mansion and he rented out the other sections. And he lived there until he died. And when he died, obviously the house went back to the bank. When they went into the home to begin the process of getting it prepared for sale, they found that he was living he was a hoarder. And so there were like, it was filled to the brim of like his belongings and like decaying food and all kinds of stuff. So in the late 19th century, the mansion was converted into an all-girls school. And during this time, there were...
For witches?
Nope. You would think, right? You'd think that there were several reports of students complaining of physical attacks by unseen forces, like stuff was just happening. The girls claimed that they were being scratched and bruised at night while they were sleeping. They would wake up with these marks on their bodies. And then of course, this is just fueling the ever-present eeriness to this place. And then it says like throughout the 20th century, the mansion continued to go through hands. So obviously the school wasn't there for very long. And then when it was no longer there, it was converted into apartments again. At one point, it was turned into a furniture store. At another point, it was turned into a bar. And
Nice.
Yep.
I'm in.
And it just continued to have like hauntings. It just constantly. So this is the most recent, currently the person that owns this home. His name is Michael Wellen, and he's a Texas-based energy trader and entrepreneur. And he purchased the mansion in 2013 following its brief ownership by Nicolas Cage, who lost the property to foreclosure in 2009.
Shame.
Nick.
Yeah, he totally, but he's going to come up again because he's got some more real weird things that he really likes New Orleans.
Yeah.
So Whalen has kept the mansion as a private residence. You cannot go inside this place. You can go past it. Ghost tours always go past the house, but there is absolutely no one allowed on the premises. But recently, reports have said that Whalen intends to restore the mansion to its original state and turn it into either a luxury museum or just high-end property. And at this time, like, again, he doesn't let anyone inside the house. So people are just kind of even more so like wanting to go in because they're not allowed to. So like, when you're not allowed to do something, you want to do it more. So yeah, this is the house. And I think what's crazy is this house sits where it's sat for years and years and years. And because it has such a crazy past, I think like more stories that come out and stuff, it just adds to the lore of this building.
Mm-hmm.
And like, who knows how much of it is actually true? I mean, the fact that when it was a school, like girls were complaining of waking up with marks on their body. Can you imagine? So
No hard pass.
I don't know. And people who visit the home say that they have there's like a very eerie and like something about it feels off. Then again, I think that's one of those things where you're like, are you creating that for yourself to make it spookier?
I believe it.
And also interesting because I think a lot of people think of the home that's in American Horror Story. Again, kind of bringing it back to that.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the LaLaurie mansion.
It is not.
But I think there's an assumption that is, and it's currently that the house that shot in that movie or show is for sale. You can buy it. But
a museum.
That is not the house.
No.
So
It's the Herman Grimm house / museum.
which is awesome.
And has its own little tale. Honestly, it's not much to say, but when I looked it up, I kind of loved it because it says that they have the friendliest ghosts in New Orleans.
Oh, it's like Casper.
Yeah, like don't we love that? I mean, we always hear about people who are getting like scratched and punched and thrown downstairs and stuff.
Murdered.
It literally says that they have a dose of Southern hospitality.
Wait, do you think this is just like a marketing scheme though, because they're trying to sell it? So they're trying to be like, oh no, they're friendly ghosts. It's like Casper.
I honestly did not know they were trying to sell it. You know, I read it more as this maybe like a Civil War museum.
Got it.
It was the Herman family who built this place in 1831 was a Jewish German immigrant family, which I was like, hey, yes, my people who moved to America to capitalize on the cotton industry. And then, you know, we have like a slew of different owners from then. And then Civil War passes through. It gets occupied by some Union soldiers during the time. They even have apparently some bullet holes still in the wood from during the time, which I'm like, well, that's kind of wild. The house had been sold for a Christian women's exchange in the 1920s. It got restored and turned into this museum in the 1970s, and it apparently remained that until today. But it says it's the ghosts of the Grimm family that still inhabit the house, and they are said to do nice things for guests and staff.
I love it.
I need one of those.
Yeah.
I know, that's a friend. I like that story.
Yeah, they've been known to warm up the house on a cold day or fill the room with the pleasant smell of lavender.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
that's a win.
That's a nice ghost.
Yeah.
I've got a not nice ghost story.
Maybe that's why they chose it for the house to film
Probably.
it, because they were just like, you know, we're talking about some dark things here. You know,
Let's have a nice house.
let's have a nice house though.
Well, I'm going to be talking about the legend of Sultan's Palace, which is what it's called.
Great.
1836, a guy, so the structure is on 716 Dauphine Street. Philadelphia-born Joseph
Wait,
Coulomb.
Delphine, like our Delphine?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, but it's Dauphine, Dauphine. So
Like, wow,
similar spelling.
I was like, she even got a street name.
She does whatever she wants, okay?
Clearly.
And it's 1836, so around the same time. This house was built by Philadelphia-born Joseph Coulomb Gardet. He got to New Orleans a couple years before, and he wanted to achieve a little bit of success as a dentist. Why are the weird doctors coming here? To the Crescent City, a.k.a. New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, a hard move for him. But his business was doing really well, and he had this local architect, Frederick Roy, design him this gorgeous home. 3.5-story mansion, which if you've looked at pictures of New Orleans, they all kind of have that similar, right?
With, like the balconies?
3 stories with the balconies. Yes, exactly. And it had a half basement, kind of like unheard of for that area.
Yeah, with the flooding.
Also, it's going to flood.
Yeah,
What an idiot.
That's wild.
So within a couple years, he didn't love the home. He spent all this money to build it, and he wanted to sell it. Who did he sell it to? The Sultan, Mr. Jean-Baptiste Lepret, who was a wealthy bank merchant, a plantation owner, and he bought the property for about $20,000, which in 1839 is a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say right now, that'd be amazing.
Well, our boy Lepret gets there. He is very wealthy, right? Like super, super, super wealthy. Obviously, he's a sultan. He is known because they have their plantation in the Palquemis Parish, and it did very well for the family. Of course, let's be honest. They didn't do anything. They had slaves who made their property very wealthy for them. So our boy Jean-Baptiste Lepret, he wanted to lease the mansion out. And he was approached by the actual sultan, a man of Middle Eastern descent. And he said that his brother, who was the real sultan, was interested in renting the property. Our boy Lepret had lost all of his money. That's why he wanted to lease this house out. So he was like, you know what? Yes, absolutely. You've got a sultan. Your brother's a sultan. Bring it on. You can have my property. The sultan comes. They move into the house. And all of a sudden, all these gorgeous Middle Eastern women come in, these beautiful, vibrant colored silks, which is something that I think we forget of this time period. Everything was like those deep colors, right? Easy for the dyes. But in the Middle East, they had these beautiful silk colors. So these gorgeous women are coming off the ship to go to the Sultan's palace. The Sultan himself shows up, and people are like, these people are gorgeous to look at. Everybody wanted to know what was going on in this house. And so as they're moving in, what else comes from the Middle East? Beautiful rugs. Rugs that like people in New Orleans could only dream of owning. So people are obsessed with this house. They're like, we need to get in there. We need to know what they're going to decorate it like. We need to know everything about it. Well, the next couple months, as they're doing this, they hear music going on day and night. Like the party never stops inside this house. Women are giggling and men are laughing, and they hear the distinct sounds of pleasure. If
Pleasure
you know
house.
what I mean.
Bow, chicka, bow, bow.
And then pretty soon people are like, what's that smell in the party house? Oh, that's opium.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
That wasn't where I thought you were going with that.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know if anyone did. But people start to realize it's not like Madame LaLaurie where you can get invited to these parties, but you have to be someone. Nobody, none of the New Orleanians were invited to these parties. So what happened in there, it's like they could hear it, they could smell it. They wanted to be there so bad.
To just knock on the door.
And, well, I
Ding
don't
dong.
think they were very nice to people.
Aww.
So they were never allowed inside the Sultan's palace, as it became nicknamed, because they obviously, but they wanted in so bad. They were starting to place goods on the doorstep, like, please let us in. They were giving gold, they were giving food, they were giving offerings, like, please let us in.
I go bribes. You're like, offering.
Deena's like, I can be bought. Then one stormy night, as it always happens, there's a night of murder. So a big storm hits the city. Everyone in the French Quarter's buckled down. Their, shutters are closed, candles are out. And as we now know in modern times, this is probably hurricane level status.
Mm-hmm.
So as the wind's whipping through the streets, everybody's in their homes as this is happening, right? So they're hunkering down, that literal hunkering down. Shutters are shut. Nobody's out in the streets. But in the morning, as it always happens, these horrible storms rip through. It's gorgeous. Sun is out, sun's shining, and they're like, what the hell just happened? Well, a guy was rolling down the street, and then he stopped dead in his tracks and screamed because on the front steps of the Sultan's palace, blood was just running out of the house like a river into the streets, which are already wet, right? So just gushing out into the streets. And he ran to the police station, and when they got there, more and more blood is coming out of this house. And they're like, what the hell? He opens a door and realizes there are bodies everywhere. Bodies are flayed open with missing limbs, as if like a beast ripped through and just ripped them apart. The officer pukes everywhere because
Clearly.
Right.
I would do the same.
Mm-hmm.
He said, the sight, the smell, and this is a quote, the sight, the smell, oh Lord, who would do such a thing? And then further into the house, I'm just saying, further into the house they go, they were just seeing more and more dead people until they got to the courtyard where the worst crime happened. So in the soil that was wet and muddy from the storm that whipped through the night before, sticking out of the ground was a single hand, fingers spread wide as if clawing for help, because the Sultan himself had been buried alive. The police never discover who committed these murders. They don't know anything about this guy who arrived before they got there. Mm-hmm. They are thinking maybe it happened within the party, but then stories start to change and they start to realize, well, he didn't ever let anyone in there. So like, we don't even know what was happening in this house. Could it have been the guy who owned the house before, LaPret, who was pissed off that this guy moved in and took over and succeeded? That's like one version of the story that they tell. But newspaper accounts are saying that the only mention of this guy in the New Orleans newspaper is when he died. So
wow,
what really was happening in this house? They have no idea. Well, in 1878, the only truth that they can find about LaPret and Jean-Baptiste and the way that this house had gone through is the Civil War struck his family really hard, and he didn't want to give up the house. He wanted to, again, he's leasing this house to this guy, right? But he's seeing how much money this guy has in this house. So people are like, maybe he took him out so that he could get his house back. Everything in that house is worth so much money. We are not actively getting all of these trade items from the Middle East the way that, is so readily accessible. The house, everything inside the house is worth so much more than the actual house. The rugs, the fineries, the silks, all of this stuff.
Well, as long as it's not covered in blood now.
Well, do you think people really care? This is also kind of a little, back to our girl, Madame LaLaurie. We don't know the facts here. Some of this is sensationalized, and no one really talked about this until 1922. A woman named Helen Pitkin Schurz wrote a tale about this, the Sultan's Palace, called The Legends of Louisiana, in her book that she mentioned this whole story. Before that, this was kind of like, oh, do you know the story of Sultan's Palace? It's not living up to that hype.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people are like, maybe somebody died and she penned this sensationalized version. But the whole blood dripping out of the door into the streets, like mixed with rain, is such a visual that, like, I mean, if more than one person has that visual, that's not something you're making up and changing over time.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 1940s, the New Orleans Academy of Art took up residence inside the home and eventually had to shut very shortly after because a lot of its students got drafted, but also because it was so haunted that people were like, you can't, like, art's falling off the wall. Students' things were being ripped apart. One of the students that was drafted, when he got to war, said it was a breath of fresh air because what was happening to him inside that school was horrific, and it felt like it followed him home. Whatever that energy was following home. Sorry, Deena, I know that's a little tough subject for you.
Traumatizing.
But eventually it was sold to a guy named Frank D'Amico in 1979. And this is a little story from him. His wife climbed into bed for the night, and she was living upstairs. Their master bedroom was upstairs. And she said there was a dark figure standing at the edge of her bed.
Oh, no.
So it began to approach her, almost gliding over the floor toward her. She panicked, obviously, turned the light on. And when she turned the light on, and this is 79, this is recent-y times. When she turned the light on, there was no one there. Okay, maybe I'm freaking out. Turns the light off. Again, the figure's coming toward her. She said the figure looked like a Middle Eastern man with a turban on his head, dressed in fine silks, with blood all over his face. And so she said that was it. We're done. We're moving. We're out. And she decided that obviously they're going to sell it. And it is now owned by a owner, Nina Nevins, who she said she doesn't think really much about the gruesome murders. And she doesn't really care. But sometimes things go missing. And that is a little alarming. So keys will go missing. She said that if there are spirits there, she probably likes them because they're really nice. They just take her keys and put them in weird spots. And sometimes things get broken. And sometimes she feels people around her. But she doesn't really care about the ghosts. They don't really bother her.
Nice.
That is a weird ass story. I've never heard that one before.
Sultan's Palace.
It made the visual of that made me think of the Game of Thrones episode, the Red Wedding.
Oh, 100%. And there was also a story about a dog. You love doggy stories, but
not if it dies. Don't even read it.
It's okay. He's not dead.
Okay.
So they've obviously, the people that have lived there have always experienced creepy stuff. But there was a guy who lived in the half-raised basement that we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And when he was going down the stairs to do laundry, he said his dog was like pushed down the stairs by a spirit. And he said that the dog now like refuses to go down into that portion of it. And no matter what he did, he said he believes that dogs can kind of sniff that out. Mm-hmm. And the dog was always super wary of going down to the basement, but also didn't want the owner to go down there by himself.
Aww.
Like would try to block him from going down there. But there was an instance where the doggy was like pushed down the stairs. So
that's that.
it is a private condo, which means it's off limits to tourists and visitors, but I want to see it.
Wow.
I want to see the Sultan's Palace. I also wish...
So you're allowed in that one?
No, it's a private residence.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're all private residences.
Yeah. And, that does make me wonder between both of these places, is that the answer? Like blocking them all off so that nobody can go in them anymore? Or should tourists be allowed to go?
For this story, though, I feel like that lady's book, very similar to maybe the Madame LaLaurie story. Mm-hmm. It was kind of like a tale, and then it was put to paper and sensationalized. Mm-hmm. So maybe that is what created all of this hullabaloo behind it. But I mean, I don't know. It's fun. Just the name of Sultan's Palace is fun to dive into.
It's definitely interesting. I mean, I never even heard of a sultan, someone from that part of the world being in New Orleans. Like, and to think that so many people came to visit him, the women and all of that, and were in there and nobody else could get in. I'm like, that's wild. Just the idea of that story, and the whodunit of it all. Like, that is pretty,
it's from one of the ghost tour.
Like, that's a head scratcher. That's what I'm
sure.
go for.
One of the ghost tours websites is where I got that Ghost City Tours that's in New Orleans. They have some really good information about it.
Yeah,
they're a really great website. And that's where I got a lot of the story. But you can obviously, on their tour, they walk in front of the house. They walk in front of all of the places that we've talked about today. But what I like about them is they give you the spooky story up front, right? And then they're like, yeah, but there was also this book written.
Right.
So, like, who's to say? I like when places that do tours kind of like, here's what's being told. Here's what we know that is fact. Make your own conclusion. That's the whole point of this.
Sure.
And something else I love about this story specifically is it's kind of called the Gardet-Lepret House. But the idea that there might be some blatant racism here, right? Like, people of unknown culture move to a new place, are doing what they do in their culture. And the guy that owned this house before, it sounds like he was kind of in a hard way, lost all of his money. Civil War kind of ruined this very wealthy family's money. And he's leasing this house to the Sultan. So maybe they just made this story like, oh, how dare you come to this place where I couldn't succeed.
And
I lost all my money.
Yeah. Or maybe it was vampires.
Or
I literally
it was
was gonna say that.
vampires. Vampires or the Rougarou.
Or the Grunch.
Our boy Grunch. But no, because it happens on Grunch Road. It has to happen on Grunch Road.
Oh, true.
I
But
mean,
maybe it was the little baby ones that popped.
Oh, the testicle ones?
Yeah.
The nutsack babies?
Yeah.
oh my, I cannot even believe you brought that up, because you know how you said the devil baby?
Yeah.
Yes.
And you brought that up with the Grunch. That actually ties back to Delphine. Because while I was reading, that came up and it said that the devil baby was a deformed or insane child spawned by a mortal woman and a demon that Marie Laveau had found and actually gave to Delphine to raise.
Well, we can dive into that because next week, that's a little teaser for what we're talking about.
Yeah.
There is a lot that happens in this city that is just so unheard of. And so, like, we just have skimmed the surface so lightly.
It's like a patchwork quilt, like where it all comes together.
It's all coming together. And all of these stories I'm finding, it's all happening around the same time, right? Like all of these mysteries. And I mean, whatever was happening in the 1800s in New Orleans, it went great.
It was rough.
And, definitely for our finale, we're going to talk about the cemeteries too in New Orleans, and Marie Laveau has a interesting little tidbit.
To those.
Yes, the same way that Delphine does, because there's this wonderful, it was a hoax that the Delphine was buried in the St. Louis Cemetery, which is, the most popular cemetery in New Orleans. But there's no way to confirm where she was actually buried, in the same way that many people were kind of like, where did she end up?
Dun, dun, dun. Well,
until next week.
Now that we've talked about the creep show that maybe is not a creep show, Madame LaLaurie, we had to cover her. So next week we're going to be diving into some creepy voodoo.
Yeah.
See you next week, guys.
Bye.
Bye. Folktown is a production of Gotham West Studios. Our editor is Katie Yonner. Our associate producer is Grace Heerman. Our senior content producer is Kyle Bosch. Our director of marketing is Dayelle Watts, and our executive producer is Tommy West. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Folktown Podcast.